In the spring of 1944, while generals, admirals, and planners debated the details of Operation Overlord, a very different kind of battle was being fought in the shipyards of New Orleans. Here, among the humid air and the smell of sawdust and diesel, a rugged, combative boat builder named Andrew Higgins was creating a vessel that would change the face of modern warfare. His design was not glamorous. It was not sleek, nor powerful, nor built for speed. It was a box of plywood and steel, flat-bottomed, ungainly, and utterly revolutionary. This was the Higgins boat, the LCVP, landing craft, vehicle, personnel, and it would become the single most important amphibious vessel of the Second World War. It carried American and Allied soldiers from ship to shore across the beaches of Europe and the islands of the Pacific. It was crude, cheap, and mass-produced, yet it altered the very nature of invasion itself. Andrew Higgins was not a naval engineer, nor a product of the military-industrial complex. He was a civilian with a fierce temper, a quick mind, and an instinctive understanding of boats born from years navigating the bayous of Louisiana. Before the war, Higgins built shallow draft workboats for loggers and oilmen who needed to operate in the tangled waterways of the Gulf Coast. These boats had to be tough, maneuverable, and capable of running aground without breaking apart. In the late 1930s, as war clouds gathered in Europe and Asia, the U.S. military began to realize that its Navy lacked an effective landing craft, something that could deliver troops directly onto a hostile beach. They had prototypes, but none worked well. The Navy's Bureau of Construction and Repair favored steel designs with deep drafts and limited maneuverability, more suitable for ports than beaches. Higgins, frustrated by bureaucracy and convinced he could do better, began developing his own solution. His Eureka boat was a 36-foot craft with a shallow, V-shaped hull, a tunnel-protected propeller, and a spoon-shaped bow that allowed it to glide over sandbars and debris. The military initially dismissed it. But in 1938, the U.S. Marine Corps, which had been studying Japanese amphibious landings in China, began to take interest. The Japanese had used small, fast boats with front ramps to land troops and vehicles directly on shore, a concept Western militaries had largely ignored. Higgins, always pragmatic, saw the genius in it. When the Marines approached him about modifying his design, Higgins didn't hesitate. Within months, he had re-engineered the Eureka boat with a steel bow ramp that could drop forward, allowing soldiers, jeeps, and cargo to roll straight onto the beach. It was a simple idea, but in its simplicity lay perfection. The first prototypes were tested at Quantico, Virginia, and on the beaches near Norfolk. Marines who witnessed the trials were astonished. Here was a craft that could run up onto the sand, drop a ramp, unload men and machines, and reverse off the beach under its own power. The Bureau of Ships remained skeptical, clinging to its own designs. But the Marines knew better. They ordered the boat in quantity, and the LCVP was born. When war broke out in Europe and the Pacific, Higgins's design went from curiosity to necessity almost overnight. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 catapulted America into a global conflict that would demand mobility on a scale never before imagined. Battles would be fought not only in the skies and seas but across beaches, jungles, and coral reefs. The U.S. military needed a way to get its men and material ashore anywhere in the world, and Andrew Higgins already had the answer. By 1942, Higgins Industries was operating around the clock. The company's facilities in New Orleans expanded from a handful of workers to tens of thousands. Higgins himself oversaw every aspect of production, driving his engineers and laborers relentlessly. His management style was chaotic but effective. He was blunt, profane, and uncompromising. If an employee failed to meet his standards, he fired them on the spot. If a naval officer questioned his methods, he shouted them down. Yet under his leadership, boats rolled off the assembly lines faster than any government yard could manage. What set Higgins apart was not just his engineering skill, but his willingness to defy convention. He hired whoever could work, black and white men, women, immigrants, paying them equally, an almost unthinkable practice in the segregated South. His workforce became one of the first truly integrated industrial teams in America. In the words of one journalist, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us, because without his boats, the Allies could not have landed on any beach, anywhere." By mid-1943, the Higgins boat had already proven its worth in North Africa, where American and British forces stormed the beaches during Operation Torch. The boats performed flawlessly, despite rough seas and enemy fire. In Sicily, Salerno, and Anzio, they delivered troops across the Mediterranean, enduring everything from artillery barrages to coastal mines. But it was in the Pacific that their true value became clear. The island-hopping campaigns against Japan, from Guadalcanal to Tarawa, from Saipan to Iwo Jima, relied entirely on Higgins boats to deliver Marines to the shore. These were not easy landings. Japanese defenders were dug into bunkers, cliffs, and coral ridges, waiting to annihilate the first wave. The Higgins boats, often painted dull gray or camouflage green, would circle offshore, their engines idling, before charging toward the beach in tight formation. Machine gun fire peppered their hulls. Mortar rounds exploded in the surf. Yet still they came, dropping their ramps into the shallow water as Marines leapt forward into chaos. The battles were brutal. At Tarawa in November 1943, the tides betrayed the first waves. Many Higgins boats ran aground on the coral reefs, forcing Marines to wade hundreds of yards under fire. Casualties were appalling, over 1,000 killed and 2,000 wounded, but without those boats, the landing could not have happened at all. Each assault refined the tactics, the coordination between Navy and Marines, the understanding of how to use these humble plywood and steel vessels as instruments of invasion. By the time Allied planners began preparing for D-Day, the Higgins boat had become indispensable. More than 1,000 would take part in the Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers toward Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Eisenhower's entire invasion plan depended on the LCVP. Ports were too heavily defended. Only beaches could offer access to continental Europe. And only Higgins boats could get men ashore in the numbers required. The scale was staggering. At dawn on D-Day, lines of Higgins boats fanned out from their mother ships, each one loaded with 36 men, cold, seasick, and silent. The wind whipped through the channel, the surf churned white, and the horizon burned with flashes of naval gunfire. The order came. "Run in!" Engines roared to life. The boats surged forward. German artillery found its range, and men crouched low as shells exploded around them. Then the ramps dropped. In those moments, on Omaha, Utah, Juneau, Sword, and Gold beaches, the simple plywood ramp of a Higgins boat decided the fate of nations. Soldiers charged forward through chest-deep water, their boots sinking into the sand, their rifles held high. Many were cut down before reaching cover. Others pressed on, crawling, clawing their way past wire and obstacles until the beach was theirs. Behind them, the boats reversed, backed into the waves, and returned for more. The cycle continued all day, all week. By nightfall, over 156,000 Allied troops were ashore, every one of them delivered by the ingenuity of a boat builder from Louisiana. The story of World War II is filled with monumental generals, secret weapons, and bold strategies. But sometimes, history pivots on the mind of a single man whose brilliance seems misplaced at first glance. This is one such story, about a Louisiana boat builder whose insane plywood invention reshaped the art of amphibious warfare and helped Dwight D. Eisenhower win the war in Europe. Our journey begins not on the battlefields of Normandy or the islands of the Pacific, but in the swamps of Louisiana, a humid, restless land of muddy rivers and tangled bayous. It was here that a wiry, sharp-tongued man named Andrew Jackson Higgins carved his own path, a path that would one day carry armies across oceans. Born in Nebraska in 1886, Higgins was not a man who followed rules. He was brash, impatient, and allergic to authority. By the time he moved south to New Orleans in the 1910s, he had already been expelled from school, blacklisted by timber companies, and was running a struggling lumber business. But where others saw swamp and failure, Higgins saw opportunity. He noticed that no boats could properly navigate Louisiana's shallow, obstacle-strewn waters. So he built his own, flat-bottomed, shallow draft craft that could slide over mud, reeds, and even logs. That was the beginning of the Eureka boat, a rugged workhorse designed to transport timber and people through the bayou. Higgins' boats were fast, tough, and maneuverable, powered by an inboard engine and a screw propeller protected from debris by a recessed housing. These were small innovations, but in the hands of a restless inventor like Higgins, they would become the seeds of something far greater. In 1938, as tensions mounted in Europe and Asia, the U.S. military began searching for new landing craft, vessels that could carry troops directly onto beaches. Up to that point, amphibious landings were painfully slow and inefficient. Traditional boats had to unload men into the surf, forcing soldiers to wade through waist-deep water under enemy fire. The losses in any such operation were expected to be catastrophic. Higgins saw a problem that fit his talents perfectly. He had already been selling his Eureka boats to oil companies, trappers, and even the Coast Guard. When the Marine Corps put out a call for a landing craft that could carry troops and vehicles straight onto a hostile shore, Higgins submitted his design, a modified version of his civilian swamp boat. But the Marines had one major complaint: troops still had to climb over the sides of the boat to disembark. Higgins, always defiant, snapped back that he could fix that, if only the bureaucrats would get out of his way. And then he did the unthinkable. In a matter of weeks, without authorization, Higgins redesigned his boat and added a drop-down steel ramp at the bow, an idea that would forever change the face of amphibious warfare. Soldiers could now run straight off the front of the boat onto the beach, weapons ready, without exposing themselves for long seconds while climbing over the sides. The U.S. Navy thought it was ridiculous. Wooden boats with steel ramps? Plywood hulls that could land tanks? The skeptics called him a loudmouth, a swamp mechanic who didn't understand modern warfare. But Higgins knew better. He built his prototype anyway, against orders, using his own money, and demonstrated it on Lake Pontchartrain. When military officials saw it in action, jaws dropped. The little plywood boat skimmed across the water, dropped its ramp, unloaded a squad of troops, and backed away in seconds. Higgins' unauthorized innovation had outperformed every other design. By 1941, as America braced for war, the Navy had no choice but to accept what Higgins had created. His landing craft, vehicle, personnel, LCVP, the Higgins boat, became the backbone of Allied amphibious operations. It was a simple craft by design, 36 feet long, capable of carrying 36 fully armed soldiers, or a jeep and crew. Its wooden hull made it light and cheap to build, while the flat bottom allowed it to beach in just a few feet of water. The front ramp turned it into a mobile bridge between ship and shore. And Higgins' factory methods, modular construction, interchangeable parts, and rapid assembly, allowed production to skyrocket. By 1943, his boatyards in New Orleans were running 24 hours a day. Men and women, white and black, skilled and unskilled, worked side by side in one of the most integrated industrial operations in the South. It was noisy, chaotic, and efficient. Higgins had turned a small Gulf Coast business into a war machine, producing thousands of boats each month. Across the Atlantic, Dwight D. Eisenhower was planning the greatest invasion in history, Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings in Normandy. He needed a way to land 150,000 men, along with their tanks, trucks, and supplies, on the beaches of occupied France. The answer lay in Higgins' workshop. Eisenhower would later say, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us. If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different." It was high praise, and not hyperbole. On June 6, 1944, the first waves of Allied troops crossed the English Channel in a fleet of over 1,000 Higgins boats. Under fire from German machine guns, they hit the beaches at Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. When the ramps dropped, men poured out into the surf, some falling instantly, others surging forward through chaos and death, but all of them delivered to the sand by a flat-bottomed boat designed by a man who once built swamp craft for lumbermen. The LCVP didn't win the war alone, but it made the invasion possible. Its simplicity meant thousands could be built quickly and cheaply. Its reliability allowed operations from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. And its impact on tactics was revolutionary. For the first time, armies could strike directly at enemy shores, not from ports or piers, but anywhere. Higgins' factories would go on to produce more than 20,000 LCVPs, along with thousands of larger landing craft for tanks and artillery. His designs were adapted for every front, from Sicily to Iwo Jima, from Tarawa to Normandy. Wherever Allied troops landed, Higgins' ingenuity led the way. But behind the legend was a man as volatile as he was visionary. Higgins fought constantly with Navy bureaucracy, accusing officers of corruption and incompetence. He swore, shouted, and even threatened to move his factory to the Soviet Union at one point. Yet even his fiercest critics admitted he got results. Higgins didn't care about decorum, only performance. By war's end, the Higgins Empire spanned several facilities, employing over 20,000 workers. His workforce had built an armada not from steel, but from Louisiana cypress and plywood. When peace came, Higgins tried to pivot back to civilian production, yachts, cargo ships, even experimental aircraft. But the post-war market had little room for his aggressive energy. He died in 1952, at the age of 65, largely forgotten outside the circles of military history. Yet his legacy lived on in every beachhead where freedom landed. Eisenhower never forgot him, and neither did the men whose lives his boats saved. To them, Higgins wasn't just a manufacturer, he was a lifeline. Today, surviving Higgins boats sit in museums around the world. Their wooden frames, scarred by salt and shrapnel, tell a story that steel never could, a story of one man's defiance, invention, and belief that even a simple plywood boat could change the course of history. In the end, the genius of Andrew Higgins was not just in what he built, but in what he saw, that victory often depends not on size or power, but on daring to do what others call impossible. His plywood ramp, once dismissed as madness, became the bridge between tyranny and liberation, the plank upon which the free world advanced. And so, in the grand ledger of World War II, where names like Eisenhower, Patton, and Montgomery dominate the headlines, one must remember the man from New Orleans, the boat builder who turned plywood and imagination into the tide that carried victory ashore.